Hello and welcome to the New School HR podcast. This is episode 02 of season 2, titled Flexible Working. In this episode, we'll be talking about the different aspects of flexible working and the sort of things you need to consider and factor into the decision-making process of whether or not you accept or reject. So we did the disclaimers for season 2 in the first episode, so I'm not going to go and repeat that. So I'm just going to jump straight in. So look, first of all, what is a flexible working request? So for me, it's a request that is made for a temporary or permanent change to a contract. Now, this could be a variation of different things. So the most common ones that I've come across is a change to the working hours. This can be either an increase or a decrease. It could be a change of the work location. So prior to lockdown and COVID, you would get some people who would actually suggest that their work should be considered as remote working or home working. Now, for me, I guess until lockdown, there was a difference between remote and home working. Remote might have been one where you would have gone to your nearest sort of site if you worked for a company that had multiple sites in a location. And it might have been that, you might have been based in and around locations. So, for example, you might have had a client or a customer for someone who was based in central London, but the person lived outside of London, so they might base themselves there. So that's what sort of the old definition used to be for me, and home working was home working, but more so now, home working is sort of covered with remote working. It could be a change of working pattern, so it could even be the same hours, but they're actually asking to either move from a night shift to a day shift, or if there's variations of shift patterns across a normal working operational day. So, for example, late night, early mornings, full days. So they might be asking to alter that, and that could be for a variety of reasons. And then the fourth most common one I come across is a change of department. So this could be, traditionally, I'll be honest, this has been usually people who are working in a chilled area or a high risk area in retail, and they want to move to literally a warmer location, or they want to move duties. I mean, sometimes you do get people who are doing roles which involve heavy lifting, and they might not be able to do that anymore. So they, ask if they could switch. And that could be for a variety of reasons why they can't do it. So I'll be honest, if I'm being completely honest, back in the day, only really saw these kind of requests from people who were heading towards retirement age. Whereas nowadays, more so, you get people with who are sharing more around health conditions and, even restraints that they might have or preferences. So you do get more of those kind of things slipping through. So the other piece is what should be including in a flexible working request. So most companies will have a template form, which is probably taken off either Expert HR or the CIPD website. So look, they're standard, but the main thing that I always ask for people to consider is the impact on the employee themselves. So what is the financial impact if there is one? What happens to the skills? So, somebody might be asking to go to a different department, but will they be required to learn new skills? Will we lose skills? The next one is the impact on the department itself. So, taking someone who's maybe been on the department for 20 years, what happens to that role? So, yes, you can get a new person, but who trains the others who are there to be up to the same level? So it's not as straightforward as just replacing a head, not for me anyway. And then there's the impact on the business. So is there a cost element? So, for example, if someone is reducing their hours and they request to reduce their hours by only 10 hours a week, are you going to be able to make a new contract? Probably not. So you might have to invest more hours beyond which you really can afford to cover those hours. Not all the time you get an influx of people that are willing to increase their hours or flex their hours to cover, someone else. There's then the impact that you have on service. So, for example, you might have someone who works weekends and they decide that they don't want to work weekends anymore, so they put in a flexible working. And they might be the most experienced person who works the weekends. So what happens there? Or they might be even in a leadership role for the weekend, which is something that they signed up to. And again, you've got a gap, and maybe you don't have the capability with what you have to offer a contract. And then there's the impact that it has on the customer. So, if, for example, in a high-risk food area, you might have someone who is highly skilled in maybe a bakery area, or, one of the highest skills that we had in the retail place I worked was fishmongers. And actually, I think we had a flexible request in from one, and it meant that we actually had no one skilled to cut salmon during Easter. Trust me, that's a problem if you can't get salmon cut during Easter. So there's things to think about. I don't think it's as straightforward as just, somebody chucks in a request and it goes there. The impact was on the customer, because if they wanted their salmon cut, and this individual was, I think he actually used to be a fishmonger in a local area, so people used to come to that location just for him. And when we took him away from the weekends, it meant that loads of people who only worked Monday to Friday wasn't able to get their fish serviced by him. So there was an impact. So, these are the sort of things that I would be mindful of consideration when, you get these kind of requests. I always ask them to be clear on their reasons why. Now, I do hear some companies say childcare shouldn't be a reason. Come on now, it's usually going to be the reason. If somebody's asking to reduce their hours or even increase because actually they've got different options. I think that's it is discriminatory, right? I'm fortunate where I've worked that hasn't been the case, but I have heard of it. It clearly says on the form, childcare is not a reason to request flexible working. Well, if we're in 2021 and we want to keep longevity and we want to promote ourselves as a employer of choice, shouldn't we be doing that approach? Shouldn't we be realistic about it? Because I can just lie to you and say it's because of health or whatever. Or even, I don't know, I could just make some shit up. But I think we should allow people to be honest about why they're doing it. But I do think they need to be clear. I don't think saying, I want to work the morning. I mean, that, to be fair, that might be the honest fucking truth, isn't it? But I would prefer a bit more background. Otherwise, it's kind of just someone asking for something. It doesn't show what they're really gaining and what we gain by it. And I think that's the other thing with this. Flexible working has to work for everyone. The last thing I expect to see, well, to be honest, I only saw this recently as well, where I'm working now, is the full process of an alternative proposal to what they are suggesting or requesting, because it's not guaranteed that a company can accommodate it. And I think there is that whole thing, if you've listened to episode 1, about the size of the business and stuff like that. But, I think everyone should always come with a compromise. I would expect to see a level of compromise. At the end of the day, there's no actual, onus to approve a flexible working. Yes, you could end up in issues if you're not fair, etc., etc. But that's why I always suggest that people have an alternative solution. So, people have the statutory right to apply for a flexible working request, and this is after 26 weeks of continuous service. So it's quite important to understand that it is a statutory right. People can ask for this. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily approve it, but it is something that people can ask for. And I think I'm quite fortunate that everywhere I've worked acknowledges it and has a process around it, but I do hear of smaller companies or locations where people aren't even allowed, or they're deterred, if you like, from asking for it. So, they just don't have a policy or anything like that. People aren't even aware of it. And that just, well, I don't even know. Well, yeah. At the end of the day, you'll get asked one and you'll have to acknowledge it anyway. So you'll have to do something. But I was quite surprised to hear that there are still places out there that don't even acknowledge it as a thing. A flexible working request, when you have a meeting, so, usually you hold a meeting where you actually discuss the whole things formally. So everywhere I've been, we invite someone formally to a meeting, we have a discussion, usually a template conversation, making sure that all the considerations that I mentioned in the previous part are covered. But on the back of that, they are entitled to have a representative. That could be a trade union rep or obviously an employee. So again, you need to be mindful of that when you're having these meetings. And I think one of the things I always try to say to people is, don't go in there with a preconception of just no. I always say to my managers, actually do some work in the background to see if you can make it work. And I'll ask them to see it before we go in ahead of the meeting. So I don't want to just see, no, it's not going to work. I want to see the evidence of it. And then obviously, I always suggest we think about an alternative as well, because we can obviously offer an alternative as well if it doesn't suit us. The request does not have to be accepted, as I mentioned earlier. However, you have to give a clear reason why it's not being accepted. So I have seen instances where people just turn around and say, business reasons. That's not really clear to me. So the kind of things I would be looking at is there a cost to replace? So using a similar example of what I mentioned earlier, if they're asking for a 10-hour decrease, will I have to get a new contract, etc. The department FTE level as well. So are you at the absolute minimum? So that 10 hours does mean that you just have no space for it. You wouldn't be able to distribute the workload. And you'd have to provide analysis for that. So I always ask people to provide data on how you're getting that, because, for me, I think there's also a piece that says you got different pieces in a department. So you might be able to swap out one person with another. But if you're unable to, then, you should have the data to support it. Loss of skill in a department. So again, if, that person has a skill set that has taken time and investment, and I think, investment is a fair thing to think about as well. If you've put training and development into someone, and that taking that person off of that is going to cause a problem, then you might want to consider that you're not going to say yes right away. Now, it might be that you say yes, and you put a caveat to say that this is dependent on someone coming in and you training them. Like I said, we can always come with a counter proposal. But we should be having consideration as to what sort of reasons we would be rejecting it for, and providing that data as well. So you don't have to provide an outcome for up to 3 months. It's quite a long time. But the piece is as well, what you need to think about with that 3 months is that there might be different solutions that you're working on. Equally so, you might have to reject it because of different decisions that you have coming on. So strategically, you might be making restructures or something like that, which may prevent you from being able to do it. At which point you'd have to be careful how you say that without saying they're going to put people at risk of redundancy or something. But there is always that as well. So the 3 months to provide an outcome, I do use that as a reference point because sometimes you just don't have an exact answer. So there's different variables that you might have to put in place. So you could use a method that I said with the, dependent on, but you got to think about the bigger picture. So if like I said, something's coming down the line, or you just know that even in 3 months' time, you might be having a labor challenge, or you might be coming into a difficult season period during your department's trends and dips in workload. So it might be that you consider that, okay, you know what, you got this coming up. You want to see how you get through that and then approve or something like that. You have that flexibility. Although, again, I wouldn't advise it. I think you'd want to get these decisions made quickly so everyone knows where they stand. In terms of coming back with counter offers, so it's almost like the different things that people can request. You can literally suggest the same thing. So it could be a different shift pattern. I have seen examples where people have asked to reduce their hours, and we have asked them to reduce it further because actually that whole thing I mentioned about being able to provide a contract to offer to recruit, to replace. It could be that you suggest a change of department. So actually, you know what, the change that they want works and they have transferable skills. So actually, if you go to this department, we can make it work because they can accommodate what you want. Something like the home working as well. People will ask for 100% home working. And actually, you might need them in. So you might say one of two options. It might be, yes, you can do, half of your shift home, half of your working week working from home. And then it might be you could actually do the whole thing at home, but actually when there's team meetings or training or whatever, then we expect you on site. Or if you have management responsibilities, then we expect you to fulfill those on site. So there are different things you can do. It doesn't have to just be a straight yes or no. And I think if you're coming back with an alternative proposal or you've rejected it, I like to actually give people the opportunity to consider different options ahead of just rejecting it and going to appeal, rightly or wrongly. So I prefer to do that negotiation with myself and the line manager as opposed to it going elsewhere out of our control. And that's why I do that. So I'm quite prepared to use that 3-month window to negotiate. I mean, when I've done that, it only takes about a week, maybe 2 weeks if they've got to redo calculations on, finances and stuff, which is fair. So at the end of the day, if you're going to go through an appeal, you're going to end up offering an alternative or something anyway. So why don't we save the hassle for everyone and try and find that compromise between actually the two parties that are involved, as opposed to, that employee going above one level and then having to go through that person's line manager and then getting a decision overall. So that is what I tend to do. So the actual meeting itself. So let's be very clear. The formal meeting should take place. What is this fucking bullshit of managers just sitting down and agreeing shit or rejecting shit without the formal process taking place? This shit needs to stop. So make sure if that is something that is happening, you put an end to that very swiftly. And the other thing I would do is I would still drag them through the formal process anyway. So I have had that a few times where a manager's been like, oh yeah, it's been agreed. Bullshit, it's been agreed. Because you get the unfair treatment piece. So just make sure that formal meeting does happen. The flexible working is acknowledged, the formal invite is sent, and the meeting takes place with a note taker. And the evidence is presented and shared with the individual. So the first thing is obviously make sure that you have your set of questions. So look, for me, I have a standard template. It covers all the questions that have been mentioned. All the different things to consider. The questions are based on that because that just makes fucking sense, right? So I have a template, the manager gets the template and literally walks it through. And you have to remember, the first meeting you don't have to accept. So it is a discussion point. And if you hear something that you want to ask or challenge, then that is the point to do it. And likewise, they can do the same. So one of the things I say to people is be mindful of what you actually say as well, because there are opportunities for people to jump on it. So we need to make sure that the employee actually covers through all the points and answers the questions that we have. But also if they've put specific things that need to be addressed in their flexible working request itself, then I'd also ask them to talk through that and explain and clarify a bit further. You have to remember, you will have sight of the request ahead of the meeting. So like I said, in terms of getting the data together and things like that, that's one thing. But I think it's also very important that you share the information in the correct way. And you give the insight into what your decision-making process will be. So for example, if you know that there's something that will be considered that will make it difficult, then I would just say it in this meeting. Like, I don't like the whole thing of building people up, especially when they're doing something. This person might be doing this as a way to resolve an issue in their personal life. It might be something that they're doing to better themselves, studies, etc. So make sure that we are fair with people. And if we have any immediate concerns, we share that. Even if we have to go back and look at other different factors again, it's worth just sharing it. So, for example, I've had it where you've had skilled roles and they've asked to go part-time. And actually, again, similar thing. How are you going to replace that 4 hours a day or whatever? Operationally, you're not going to be able to move someone across from another department, etc., etc. So I would make the manager be quite clear to say, look, just letting you know that this might be an issue and this is why. And then you're giving that person a bit of thought, and they might even come up with a solution or alternative themselves throughout that process. So I have had that where somebody has put in a request for, say, a 50% reduction. And when we've said that this might be a concern, they said, actually, okay, if I can move my one shift back, so I would still be here for this and that as a consideration. And that's how you negotiate. You speak to people, you have a discussion. I think the other thing to point out is if a request is unfair, then call it out. So I've actually sat in a flexible working recently where an individual just thought it was their given right to just move, like from an evening to a morning shift. I tell you what, it fucking wound me up because there was no substance behind it. He literally just turned around and said, well, I've been here for 10 years and yeah, I'm getting old. This is what he said, yeah, I didn't say this. I'm getting old and I just don't want to be up at that time anymore. Okay, so obviously you have the right to put it in. You have the right to give us your reason. But he generally walked in the fucking room like it was his God-given right. So, yeah, that didn't go down well with me. Subsequently, it's going to be approved. But, I think we have to be mindful that there are characters, etc. And how the decision we make can be perceived and what the precedence has been. So, for example, if we said to one individual, you can't do that because there's no vacancy where you want to go or no space, whatever we want to word it, then making an exception for someone, for me, is not the right thing. You have to be fair and consistent. So I get it, the circumstances and situations change. So, it is a first come, first serve. I guess the thing to say is that, if somebody applies for a flexible working, they can't apply for another one for 12 months. Unless you've put some sort of agreement in there. So, if you've rejected someone, there's every possibility that they might find out, but situation has changed, they can't apply again, so you're giving it to this one. I guess you can think of that, but at the same time, if you actually are going out of your way to accommodate one person, why didn't you do that for the first one? And that's where I have a problem. Adjourn to make a decision, and I don't mean make a decision on the day. So if you have to consider things, go away and look at it. Like, I've seen some challenges which are really fair to say that, I want to go to here and actually you've got agency staff there, so why can't you just move the agency staff? That's a very fair challenge. Why can't we do that for, someone who is effectively one of our own? And if you need to go away and actually ask that question, because let's be real, the employees will think of things and see things that we don't see. So I've had it where employees have come back and said, if you do this, actually operationally it's better because I've worked this shift and da-da-da-da-da. So you might have to go away and actually take on board what they say. Like, we're not always right. And, if you're promoting a workplace where you support people in speaking, etc., then of course you want them to have the opportunity to do this. In terms of giving a decision, I prefer that we meet the individual. So I do know places where they send the letter out and just say accept or reject, and this is why. I'm very much, I think I've said it throughout the whole podcast, I'm very much a face-to-face, or even if it's a phone call, but giving the explanation and outlining why, and allowing that person to ask us questions as well, as opposed to getting a letter and then writing an appeal. Make sure when you give the outcome, it's consistent. So if you say in person, it has to match in the letter that you give. And so therefore, I don't go into fucking War and Peace. I'm really against these 7-page outcomes and shit. So just give the outcome as it is. Give the rationale. Have the data to support it. I go as far as to provide the data because look, we ain't got nothing to hide, yeah? That's the only way people understand. So I would suggest that as well. If there's a proposal thing, make sure you meet again and make sure you give the person the opportunity to ask further questions. And, I have had one quite recently where the negotiation part, if you like, was 3 stages before giving the outcome. And actually we came to a really amicable agreement. The person feels a lot better about it. They didn't feel great about what our proposal was and the reasons why we would have rejected. But again, you coming back to the whole thing about appeal, we've avoided it going to a director. The line manager has managed the whole situation through. The line manager is the face of the compromise, and that's what you need. You need decisions to be coming from your line manager. You don't want them coming from the level above. You want them coming from the line manager. And that way, it's yeah, we had a bit of a disagreement, but actually, we agreed on something. We found something that works for everyone. And that's really important. That's really powerful. And to touch on the appeal, you need to make sure that they understand they have the right to appeal. I do see a lot of people kind of not emphasize that. And, sometimes I know we give a letter and it's on the letter that they have the right to appeal, but somebody who maybe is pissed off or whatever, they might not read it. It goes past the window. They've lost the right of appeal, and then you've just got a really pissed off person who then potentially takes you to a tribunal route. So it's always worth just making sure that they understand that. And I've done that even in negotiations. So I'll explain to them, this doesn't take your right of appeal away. This conversation, like I've had written, formalized sort of appeals, if you like, on the decision, even though I've not given the outcome. And I think, what do we have to lose? If anything, doing an extra step just supports us even more. At least we can demonstrate we were trying to find a really good, amicable solution. And the manager can demonstrate that. So this is, it's quite important how you handle this, to me anyway. So you've had the meeting, and yay, we are accepting the flexible working request. So the first thing I would say is make sure you have an understanding of the impact that accepting this request is going to have. So this is on the department potentially losing someone or gaining someone. What is the impact on the employees in or around that person's role? So, for example, the receiving department. It might be someone that used to work on that department. It might be someone who's moving to a department where they have had previous history with someone. It could be anything. So do have that in mind before you go ahead and accept. There is a thing of team fit. You don't want to disrupt the whole team necessarily because you're just trying to move someone for the sake of it. And I have seen this happen quite a few times in a retail place I was at. Somebody requested it. It was a large organization. Of course, they could accommodate it, but they didn't think about where they were putting that person. They just kind of shucked them in there. And that can cause absolute carnage. I have seen it many times before. Yeah. And then, some of the environments that we work in, you can have a change of management at any given time. And then that can cause a fucking problem too. So just be mindful of it. Where are you putting this person? I would always say if you're able to accommodate it within the department that your person is in. The other thing to think about is, have you rejected something similar very recently? I know I just spoke about and I touched on the whole 12-month thing, but I think, in terms of employee engagement, and if you're, trying to be an employer of choice and all this good stuff, and if you've got values as well, if you're seen to be giving someone different treatment to someone else, especially if you've made an exception for someone, then of course you're going to get questioned about fairness and equality. And, likewise, you might accept something actually because of fairness and equality. So it can be both ways, but I think just make sure you've considered that, because I think sometimes we make decisions and we don't think about what the potential implications are of those decisions. The long-term impact, you need to think about your department. Are you going to recruit? You might not actually have to recruit. I think that's something as well. Like sometimes in the past when I've been a manager myself, I use this as an opportunity to actually think about the realignment of my department. So are my duties assigned in the right way? Now, some things, for example, when I had pickers, you can't do anything about that. You need the pickers, especially if you're growing, etc. But some roles do very specific things, and I used to think to myself, if somebody asked to reduce, the first thing I'd look at is what is their actual activities, and could I use those activities as a development opportunity for someone? Or could I manage that better? Like, is it a process thing? Like, because I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I always used to list, by hour what they did every week. I know that sounds really long, but then, like I say, I sometimes use those tasks as development. I used to sort of divvy it up against who I had as well. So like, I love multi-skilling. I think having employees who are multi-skilled is a great asset to all businesses. So I used to see, was there an opportunity for the person who maybe is reducing hours to train someone? And then that would give me more coverage because, for example, when that person goes on holiday, I had no one. So now I had potentially 3 or 4 people trained up to do that activity. So holiday wasn't an issue at all. In fact, they could have reduced their hours even more. Yeah. So you need to think about that. How are you going to handle that gap? The other thing is as well, if the person is changing, maybe they're in the same department but changing the activity that they do, what does retraining look like and how long is that going to take? That is, I think, something that is usually underestimated. So if somebody is going to a new department or doing anything new, because they might be really good at what they do and they've done it really well for a long time, doesn't mean they're going to take the new thing so well. And then, I have seen it where we perceive that person is no longer, performing to a reasonable or high standard. And then we want to performance manage that person. But actually, you haven't considered that after, 2 years of doing an activity, you've then asked them to do something else with very minimal training. So you do have to consider that. And, I've already sort of touched on it in terms of the skill gap and the impact it has on the service. But you do have to think to yourself, what is the overall impact? If it is going to hinder you, because I do see instances where flexible working requests have been accepted purely to avoid confrontation, and that is not the reason to accept it. And so have that full process. Ensure your managers are comfortable with the fact that given the outcome could be a really difficult conversation. So yeah. The next thing is, so if you've accepted it, making sure you have the correct paperwork filled out. This bit always goes amiss. See what your processes are in terms of documentation that you provide. So usually it's an outcome letter. Usually somebody has to sign something. I'm in a place where I prefer to issue a new contract. I do use flexible workings as a point in time as well. So if you've got someone who's on an older contract that needs to be refreshed and you just haven't issued one because either the business has decided not to do a cleanse or they were missed, whatever, I always use the flexible working as an opportunity to get out the new T's and C's to them because they have to read it, they have to sign it, and actually, why would you not just put them where they need to be? Now, this is obviously not replacing 2P or anything like that, so those who are 2P'd in, they would have their own specific terms and conditions, and you'd have to make sure that you follow that format that's relevant for them. But in terms of your own business and contracts, yes, I use that as an opportunity to update. Things around notice periods and stuff like that may or may not change, but generally most companies stick to statutory anyway. But it's always cleaner if you've got the most recent contracts to hand. At least you're more aligned. I think one of the things I find is when you're doing projects that require to know contractual details, having 4 or 5 different contracts in the same company can be confusing. The part of it when you accept it is to make sure that you agree when these new, if it's a change of hours, for example, or shift patterns even, when these will take effect. That is quite important. And then the other thing to think about is the impact that it has on the individual's payroll. So for example, annual leave, if they weren't working bank holidays, but they now are, holiday entitlement changes, have they taken too much holiday? What's the difference in salary? These are all things that I like to ensure that they understand before they actually sign any new documentation. Things like breaks as well. These things get overlooked, So you might have contracts that are, 37.5 hours because they don't have the break paid. If they're reducing their hours, do they still get a break? Whether that's paid or unpaid. That is quite important to know, and it's quite important that the individual knows it. The next thing is to think about the implementation of it. So what is the message you're going to deliver? Now, I know it's personal why someone would put in a flexible working, but obviously if you have to redistribute workload or whatever, then you're going to have to explain why. And I always make sure that when we do flexible working, and if that's the outcome that there's going to be more like workload or pressure on a team, I always ensure that that person understands that as a consequence of this, I am going to have to do X, Y, Z, so reallocate work or whatever. And the right thing to do in that instance is to let the team know why. Well, they're going to know anyway when the person doesn't come in on a Monday, right? But is there on a Tuesday, or doesn't start at 8:00, they now start at 10:00. So let's keep it real for a minute. So yeah, look, I outline that and I explain it, and I've never had a pushback or anything like that. Usually 9 times out of 10, the fucking team knows that they want a flexible working request before you do anyway. So let's keep it real. I just had a really good thought, but I've lost it. No, go on. The other thing to think about is the managing of expectations. So if there is going to be a service change for a customer, as an example, so if somebody serviced a customer Monday to Friday, and they might have had that client relationship with someone, and that's no longer going to be there because actually someone else is going to be covering Monday and Wednesdays, then that needs to be managed as well. So we need to make sure that the client and customer understands that, for 20% of the week, they'll now be covered by Bob as opposed to Susie. There's no reason why I chose those names specifically. But yeah, that's quite important. And obviously, sometimes that could present a problem in itself. You might have a client who's had a very long-standing relationship with someone, especially if you've got someone who's reducing their hours because they want to increase their work-life balance as they're in a later part of life. But look, it's inevitable. So, one of the things I've always kind of said is that, you're not losing them 100%. And actually, this person's going to be there for these days. So you might find that person gets a high workload on the 3 days they're in because the customer's exploiting them being in. But that's part of it, and that's the managing expectations, I guess, around the individual as well, to understand that potentially there might be an impact on them as well as a consequence of this. The one thing I always ask for when I accept a flexible working is some flexibility. So if there's a proposal back, especially, if somebody's asking to move off from an PM to an AM or whatever, I will ask that they have availability to cover. So for example, if you've got senior managers who are putting flexible work in, I would ask them to have availability to cover holidays, or if they are able to support on days. So, the days that they're in, are they actually able to stay to support if required? Because that's the kind of thing you do need to cover, I think, as well. I think there has to be an adult conversation. It can't just be all one way, and the business does have a need, especially for a senior role. You're not going to get sign off to get another full-time manager. Let's keep it real. You're not going to get that, so you're going to need that coverage. But the other fair pushback is, well, why can't other managers cover? It's a very good comeback. But, ultimately, if they're the one leaving the gap, you would expect them to be the first ones to flex if, you have set core hours. So, yeah. And then, look, we do have the option to give a trial period as well. So, usually 3 months to 6 months is kind of the standard that I use. I have given a 1 month trial for something that, we've agreed something, but actually there are other people who have asked for the same thing. So I might reduce it to 1 month to say, look, I'm just making you aware that there are other people who have asked this, and, I need to know if it works for you or not. And if it doesn't, then obviously I have people lined up who it could or does work for. So again, that whole transparency piece behind it. But the trial period, you need to make sure that if it's not working, we have to explain why. And I think that's quite key, because if you're not, this is going to sound like you're setting people up to fail, but if you, for example, have someone who's asked for home working and they've been home working for 6 months, you've never asked them to do anything other than work from home, but you reject it because you believe that it's an issue then working from home. But you've never tested it, so how the fuck do you know? So I would always say to people, especially with the home working one, if you've got a concern, you need to fucking test it. So for example, if someone has relocated far away, so maybe 2-3 hours away from the work location, and they've asked to work from home because home is in a different part of the country, but they've said, they're willing to travel for meetings, etc. If you've allowed them to do everything remotely via Zoom, then of course they have a case to say it's working. If there's been no issues, there's been no training issues, there's been no management issues, etc., what's your fucking problem then? So I always say to the managers, if you're agreeing these kind of things, you need to make sure that you're actually testing that. Otherwise, you've got no data. And that's the other thing. Some of the things that we're asked to do, we don't have any data. And just saying a simple thing of, actually, you know what, let's go to the next part. So the reason I stopped it there is because I realized the next section was about rejection and consequences. So we'll cover it here. So look, the bit I was going to get to is sometimes we get, we think that we can reject something, but we've got no data to support it. So for example, you might have a role. Well, I've had this. So you have an AM and a PM of a role, and the PM person hasn't actually been a role for about 2 years. And then somebody comes back from long-term sick or a maternity or whatever, and they're supposed to go straight into the PM one. And they put a flexible working request in to say they don't want to do a late shift. They want to do, a regular sort of shift of a 9-6 or 10-7, whatever. And you say no because the operation needs that to be a PM. But for 2 years or 3 years, you've not had anyone doing that role at all. So where is your argument? The data doesn't support it. You've ran without it for 3 years. So why are you now saying that role has to be PM? And there's no comeback for that if it's been that long. Otherwise, you would have recruited it. You wouldn't have left it as a gap, or you would have had a temporary person there. So you have to think about it. When you're rejecting it, you have to think about what the person is saying, what they're asking, and what the challenge is, because that will then take you down the unfair route. So look, some of the consequences of rejection. The biggest one I see is the loss of engagement. Quite often, you get a loss of engagement as soon as you try to negotiate, to be fair. We had one recently where I used the example, they wanted to decrease their hours. We had to ask them to decrease it more so we could recruit, because unfortunately that was just the core hours for that department. But that person felt really hurt by this decision. They felt that we didn't value their loyalty. They said that we just think about ourselves, the business isn't thinking of the individual. They have a health concern. All this kind of stuff was chucked at us. And to be fair to the individual, I can understand how she would come to that place. I totally understand it, but it wasn't that case at all. It was just the simple fact of we couldn't cover our hours with a reduction of 8 hours. We just wouldn't be able to offer a contract to someone. We're not in the business of 0-hour contracts. So yeah, is someone going to sign up for an 8-hour contract? I don't fucking think so. I think the other thing is we think of the individual impact on that person that we say no to, but that also has an impact on the team. So sometimes the team will look at it and think, how the fuck can you do that to that individual? Think about the length of service, etc., etc. But the other thing is you get them deterred from actually putting in their own requests, whether that's flexible, whether that's ideas, whether that's something. Because sometimes these flexible working requests have ideas that probably have been discussed with a team. So you have to think about that. If it's something that is said, think about the individual in front of you. Can they get to that place by themselves? I don't care how fucked up that sounds, but can they get to that place themselves? And if they're talking about discussions with team or teammates, and I've had it where people have said, my teammates are not quite sure why I'm still here. They're not quite sure why this and that. So think about the impact it has on the wider team, especially when it comes to ideas, because some of your best ideas come from your team. You do then get the potential of appeal. So if you use my example and negotiate within the constraints of the first meeting using adjournments to negotiate, you should eradicate that appeal. I've done appeals for other departments, and not that I've overturned the original decision, but the reality is once you take it to another HR person in your team, their stance might be completely different. So I know for a fact my way of looking at the appeal that I had was completely different to the team that did the original hearing. You can see that just in the way we delivered the outcome. And there's always going to be that risk if you take it away from yourself that someone is not going to understand it, or they're just going to override it because they might have a leniency factor different to yours. They can look at things as a more holistic view. I think the thing we fail to do when we reject a flexible working is usually think about the bigger picture, which is actually, the next point. So I'm going to come to that later on. I think you have to be mindful that, the rejection of a flexible working can lead to a claim if it's a protected characteristic and they feel like they're being unfairly treated, or we're not, seen to make some sort of reasonable adjustment. The other thing is somebody might be putting a flexible working request because of an illness that they have, and they might be trying to stay in work and support themselves. And so you got to be very mindful of that. Like, I've had I say a few, I've had about 4 or 5 of them where people have asked to reduce their hours because of help. The person I mentioned in the previous podcast with the MS, he put in a flexible working request to reduce his hours. So be mindful of that as well. If somebody's actually trying to be in work and trying to minimize their absence, I don't care if people think that that's not under the flexible working thing, but if somebody's actively trying to do something, let's think about that. The other thing to think about is we're in 2021. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, there are companies that don't even acknowledge flexible working requests. But we have to think about the brand image. You get a lot of bad press out there for not being flexible, not allowing people to work from home, these kind of things. And there is more and more challenges. I've seen it in the environment I work in now, where you'd think to yourself that predominantly the roles are not home-based, but we do get inventory roles and stock control roles that are being able to be done remotely via a laptop. And sometimes, being able to source a piece of equipment can enable that to happen. And sometimes thinking about the cost of, using the example, if you have a laptop contract agreement, how much is a laptop for you to get? And if you got taken to a claim, how much would that cost you? So I do urge people to think about things, the brand image and the sort of brand reputation damage that it has. If you go on things like Glassdoor or LinkedIn or whatever, you'll see feedback on this kind of stuff, whether or not flexible working is there. I've seen it in the previous company I worked at where there was comments made about the fact that, flexible working was just not even a consideration. And if you think about it, are you discriminating against potentially females who have pregnancies or whatever, and want to come back? They want to stay in a role, because that's usually where I, from my experience, have seen issues, if you like, where managers have not been willing to sort of be flexible. And I do get the whole thing about first come, first serve. I understand that, and I do get the piece around being operational, etc. But look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture, which is the title of the next part of the podcast. So I think the thing to think about is, what does the employer want to be known as? What is the mission and the values and the statement that go along with the business? And, what are they trying to promote? And flexible working plays a big part in that. I very recently was talking about sabbatical leave, which isn't part of flexible working, but I was talking about it, and my manager turned around and said, Well, it got shut down. Pap, like that, literally. And my manager turned around and was like, well, actually, if we want to be a modern employer, we should consider this kind of thing. I was like, boom. Obviously, I enjoyed it. But yeah, that's the thing, right? We need to think about things. We're not in a draconian age. It's not 9 to 5 anymore. I think the lockdown has shown us that we can work in and around. I mean, I was saying to my wife today, I was literally doing my workout at 7:30 and I was replying to emails at the same time. Am I getting paid for that? No. Did I have to do that? No. But the reality is I could. I could easily do an hour in the evening and not do an hour in the day. And, I used to work in retail, as we know, and I used to get weekdays off. And I didn't realize until I got the Monday to Friday job how difficult it is to fit everything in before 12 o'clock on a Saturday in terms of banks and stuff. Life is hard if you're working Monday to Friday till 6 o'clock. Banks and post office shuts at 5:30. What the fuck are you supposed to do then? GPs, yes, you get more availability in the evening, but again, how many people are going to book those slots between 6 and 7? I'm just saying. So think about it, people with kids, you usually have to ask for a favor, right, to get to go to your kid's Christmas play or something. So there's various different things to think about. I think if you have a union, unions will push for flexible working. I did a disciplinary, and it was around this person. I can't remember, they had errors or whatever it was. And this person had asked for flexible working, and we'd rejected it. This is before I got here, because I would have just fucking given it. Makes sense. We sat in this disciplinary, and the union person just literally ripped us apart and said, she is stressed, and, she has got a lot on, and she's a carer, etc. And she asked for flexible working, and you was able to accommodate her, but you chose not to. And he said to me, why? And the honest truth, I could not fucking tell you why to this day why we didn't approve it. In fact, I had asked for the data way before in advance because I knew this was going to be a fucking problem one day anyway. As soon as I found out about it, it happened before I joined. And what do you do? And he actually said to me, he was like, I know she can't apply for 12 months, however many months were left, but he said, I'm hoping you give an exception in this circumstance, given the position we are in. Boom! And I was like, oh, my guy. My guy had me. And this is the point. This is what people don't see. We as the HR professionals, we're supposed to know this stuff. I mean, obviously, people can go against it. And unfortunately, this decision had already been made before I got here, so I couldn't really do anything to influence. But we have to think about these things. I actually had to edit the last bit out because that was really unprofessional. I can't even think how I even said that. But anyway, it is first come, first serve. That is a thing to remember. But as I've said, be consistent. Don't start making exceptions for your family favorites. This ain't Quality Street. This ain't about getting the strawberry ones and looking after them. I like the strawberry one, just in case. Understand why the request has come in. What is the gain? Yeah? What is it they're after? Because the ones I see more so now is home working. I mean, I have to be honest. I sat in one where an individual wanted to have home working full time so that they could do yoga in their break time. And also because they wouldn't have to commute anymore because they decided to move an hour and 30 minutes away from work. Well, firstly, you decided to move. Nobody asked you. And secondly, we'd all like to do our activities in our lunch break. But anyway, we did reject it. We did reject it because the main rationale was around the commute and the traveling time. And I'm sorry, but that's not our fucking problem. That is not our problem. We did not ask you to move. And therefore, if the whole team are being expected to be in the workplace, that is, that's on you. And you moved before the lockdown. You were complying with it. But the one thing we did say was that we would consider home working and how it's going to work. And that's the reality. That is what we're going to do. We're going to consider how it can work. But we're going to do it evenly for everyone. It's not just going to be for one individual. And that was the message that went back. And she wasn't happy with that. And I thought to myself, I think that's fair because, your teammates haven't, your teammates are in the same position. They're working from home now too. And they haven't come with any of these things. And what we're saying is that we want to offer it to everyone, not just one individual. Rightly or wrongly. But the reality is we're not going to have that team working from home 100%. It just doesn't work. It's worked because the team have been given an allowance, if you like, because people understand. But, the reality is it's an on-site role. You need to see the premises, etc. How are you going to do that from home? So, yeah. I think you do get the requests for temporary changes. So I had one recently where the individual's partner was going to be on a work placement, so they needed to change their hours. Now, yes, they went through the flexible working process, but I think for me, if we're talking about ad hoc changes, reasonably short changes, I wouldn't go through that route personally. I'd just do that as an agreement, as a change of working pattern, and do that through the system, payroll system or whatever. So I think you have to think about what's come through as well. Is it actually a flexible working request? Things like, I think I had one where somebody had asked if they could start half an hour earlier. So they put it through as a flexible working request, which I guess in theory is the right thing. But it wasn't for any reason other than they had no work to do. Like, literally, imagine somebody said, "Excuse me, sir, got no fucking work. Can I come here earlier?" Fucking amicable, if you ask me. But yeah, that for me was an actual issue with delegation of task, not a flexible working request. So do have to think about what is sitting in front of you as well. I've mentioned depth of service and skills, etc., so I'm not going to touch on it again. The one thing I do want to get across is that, flexible working and the requests. If you're in a site which has 5 departments across 250 people, don't just look at your own team of 6. And I think I've talked about moving across to other department stuff, but don't just think about your team of 6. Think about the bigger picture. Sometimes I have lost skilled people through flexible work into other departments. But you know what? If the business retains that person and that person's value, then I'd rather we keep it rather than we lose it. Because you get those scenarios where, if you can't accommodate a flexible working, the person has to leave. It's just what it is. I've had it with people who have had to, they've asked for it because their partner is pursuing something or whatever, and unfortunately they're not the highest earner in the household, so actually they're not going to prevent the highest earner from doing that. And then you lose that person for the sake of what, 2 hours? Even if you replace that person at full time, you've lost more than that 2 hours. Like, have a holistic picture. Think about it. If you've got someone, you look at an individual and you think to yourself, they do X amount of work in X amount of time. And using my assessment exercise, what do they do in their whole time? If you've got someone who is working that 20% over the capacity that they should do, and they're asking for a 15% decrease, do the maths. That's what I say. And I think likewise, if you've got someone who's going to request to increase, and they can add to what you've got significantly, I would consider if it's worth the extra cost. When I was a line manager, like I have done it. I budget wise, I can't afford it. When I had the online operation, I had quite a few people want to increase their hours because they went part-time because they hated it before I got there. Yes, that's how good a manager I was. And I used to think to myself, if I had these people longer, could I add another van? And I took that operation, I think we've said it enough times, from like 4 vans to 10. But it was those risks that I took, I guess. The trust in the people that I had that enabled that to happen. So for me, the flexible working thing is a really great tool because sometimes it forces you into a position to think differently. I wouldn't have grown that operation without flexible working. That's the honest truth. I wouldn't have got to 10 vans because I would have just stuck to my budget hours. I would never have explored, adding my top shoppers to longer hours. You think about it. You got people who can do, like in this instance, they were shoppers and they could knock out. I know it doesn't make any sense to anyone, but they could knock out, let's say, 3 vans worth of work, yeah, in the short time that they're there. If I had them for another 3 hours, that's 1.5 vans. Think about it. So that's all I would say. So look, that brings me to the end of this podcast. Somehow we've racked up an hour. I didn't think it was going to be that when I started this. There wasn't that many topics on here. So that's my summary of flexible working. That's a bit of my mindset behind it. I think it was a bit repetitive, but it's all in context, right? So look, hopefully you got something out of it. And if you've got any feedback, any questions, any suggestions, any challenges to anything I've said, please put it in the comments, send us an email. But for the time being, take care, keep safe.